South Africa could experience an economic and political collapse by 2030. That's the warning of economic risk consultancy firm Eunomix Business and Economics Limited. The organization says to prevent this, growth-friendly policies and a new economic model are needed. The Johannesburg-based firm blames apartheid for the current unequal society. The company says the COVID-19 pandemic has only made matters worse. Now, Intellidex director Peter Attard Montalto says the collapse is a possible scenario, but unlikely. He joins me now live to unpack. So thank you very much for your time here on eNCA. Now, first of all, South Africans are becoming very despondent. We're hearing very bad news, day after day, week after week. Could we really find ourselves in such a tragedy by 2030?
Good morning. Well, the report that you cite references a very interesting scenario, and this is basically, we need to think about it as a sort of baseline. I think if nothing happens, if there isn't reform, if growth doesn't increase. And one of the shocking things I think that people haven't fully realized after last week's GDP is that if we don't basically see growth starting to be higher than population growth, that's higher than 1.5% a year, then basically the economy is going to be held on this downward trajectory in per capita output terms. And those sorts of countries generally suffer from deep social and political crises. And that is the path South Africa is on. But the government has committed to structural reform. That's what we're waiting for, to lift that growth rate higher. And this is really the crucial moment we're in at the moment. The discussion is going on in Nederland on the recovery, the government's own recovery plans as well, and why we're at such an important juncture.
Now, when you look at, the allegations against politicians and corruption here in our country, could that be the reason why so many organizations or firms are, giving us such a negative trajectory?
Well, I think that's definitely playing into it. I mean, I think that's viewed as something that's easy to stand up against, easy to solve. And I think that's why there was such frustration with the president for so long on the corruption issue. He's now at the last NEC meeting, of course, stood up much more firmly on that and pinned his colours to the mast. But now we need to see that same thing happening again on reforms, on those difficult decisions to be taken. And that's really the problem, I think, for the reform trajectory. It's ultimately all political. It's things like sweeping away vested interests who are politically connected, making difficult ideological choices on the role of the state versus the private sector. These are things and debates that are only really just being started to be had actually in South Africa, and need to be resolved pretty swiftly to ensure that South Africa sees absorption of the jobs lost from this coronavirus crisis.
Maybe let's bring in something. Is there anything positive that we could look to by 2030? Is there anything that government can do and society can do to save the country from an economic and political collapse? In 10 years, that's quite soon.
Well, it's soon and it's not soon as well. I mean, I think a lot of things can happen if we think of the acceleration globally in renewable energy investment, for instance. South Africa could entirely transform its energy sector by that period if it took the right decisions right now. Some hints last week about the acceleration of the renewables procurement rounds coming forward, potentially a little bit of a glimmer of hope on that, potentially. If we're thinking slightly more strategically, potentially going to an IMF program, having these reforms imposed from outside, that's incredibly politically challenging, of course, but could be a route to getting these reforms through. And simply, I think a different style of leadership from the president could also be a positive that emerges through the rest of this term and into a second term, which would, of course, take us towards the end of that period you outline. If indeed there is a realization that you have to ultimately govern for the country and not the party. And again, we saw a little bit of a spark of that last week in that Tuesday webinar that the president did with the National Editors Forum, a little bit of a difference in language about how annoyed he personally is with the lack of reform. But ultimately, decisions really have to be made now, given the depth of this crisis, and the country really needs to accelerate away from that as quickly as possible.
Thank you very much, Mr. Montalto, coming to us live from London, talking to us about the South African economy.